Now let's consider the welfare cost of monopoly. But before we get there, let's review so you can compare the welfare of the economy when we had perfect competition. When you had perfect competition, to study welfare, we gave a new interpretation to the demand and the supply curve. The demand curve, using the concept of willingness to pay, we start calling it the value curve. Why? Well, consider for instance Unit 5. The maximum amount of money the consumers are willing to pay for the extra Unit 5 is 50. So that is the maximum price the consumer is willing to pay, which corresponds to the value of the marginal Unit 5 to the consumer. So the demand curve can be called the value curves, more specifically the marginal value curve. We also call it the price curve, since the maximum price the consumer is willing to pay. Now, the supply curve, we also had a new interpretation. For instance, consider again Unit 5. The minimum price the firms are willing to accept to sell the marginal Unit 5 is 20. I know that because of the supply curve. Now, the minimum price the producers are willing to accept is enough to cover the cost. So you give the interpretation of the supply curve as the cost curve. After chapter 14, that became even more obvious when we saw that the supply curve is actually the marginal cost curve. So now it's not only a different interpretation, it is actually the definition of the supply curve. And then we had the definitions of consumer surplus and producer surplus. For instance, for the consumer, Unit 5, he was willing to pay 50, but he only had to pay 30 because that's the equilibrium price. So that is extra for Unit 5. Now, this is true for every unit. So instead of adding up unit by unit, you pretend it's a triangle here. And we also defined the concept of producer surplus. The minimum price the producer was willing to accept to sell the fifth unit was 20, but he actually got 30. So this is extra. Now, adding up for every unit, that's the total producer surplus. And the idea is to maximize total surplus, which is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus, and that's done exactly here. When price, or the marginal value given by the demand curve, equals the marginal cost given by the supply curve, at this point, I maximize total surplus. So in a competitive market, equilibrium price equals marginal cost, total surplus is maximized. Again, price from the demand curve equals marginal cost from the supply curve. Right here where they cross, that's when the curves are equal. However, in the monopoly, price is larger than marginal cost. So what's going to happen is the value to buyers of an additional unit exceeds the total cost of resources needed to produce that unit. As you're going to see, the monopoly quantity is too low. It doesn't maximize welfare. It doesn't maximize total surplus. To maximize total surplus, it should increase Q. It doesn't produce enough to maximize total surplus. It would maximize if you produce more of it. Thus, the monopoly results in a deadweight loss. Here's another way to see that. This quantity here should not be produced because the cost is larger than the value. The cost given by the supply curve is larger than the value given by the demand curve. This quantity should be produced because the value given by the demand curve is larger than the cost. So all the way up to this quantity, it should be produced. That's the efficient quantity. And that happens again in perfect competition. When you have a monopoly that we're studying this chapter, this is marginal cost and marginal revenue is always below the demand curve. So the monopoly quantity is here, not here. Again, that will be the optimum, but that is the monopoly quantity where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, which is smaller than price. Why? Because the golden rule of profit maximization is marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But in a monopoly, that's not equal to price anymore. That means that this amount of surplus disappeared is the deadweight loss of the monopoly. Let's go back to the slide of perfect competition again. In monopoly, the quantity will be, for instance, 10. So this amount of surplus here in this triangle will disappear, reducing total welfare. There is a way where the monopoly can extract even more surplus from the consumer. It's called price discrimination. Discrimination, treating people differently based on some characteristics such as race or gender. Price discrimination means selling the same good at different prices to different buyers. The characteristic using price discrimination is willingness to pay. A firm can increase profit by charging a higher price to buyers with higher willingness to pay. Let's see that in a graph. Here's the demand curve. Here's the marginal revenue curve. Here's the price that the monopolist charges. Here's the optimal quantity, the quantity the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. To get the price, you go to the demand curve. So the consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve above price. Now in this example, to make things easier, the marginal cost is constant equals to the average cost. Therefore, if this is also average cost, we already saw how to identify profit in a graph. Price minus average cost times Q is profit of the monopolist. Now here I am assuming no price discrimination. So here's the profit of the monopolist, and here's the consumer surplus. Here's the deadweight loss caused by a monopoly. If it was perfect competition, price equals marginal cost, the quantity would be here, and welfare will be maximized. Now consider the following strategy. Perfect price dissemination. Charge each person exactly his or her willingness to pay. There's no way the monopolist to know that, but assume he could know. So, person 5 here, it's willing to pay up to that much. Assume the monopolist knows the demand curve and knows exactly how much the market is willing to pay for unit 5, for instance. So charges exactly that amount. In that case, consumer surplus is 0 and producer surplus is everything. Now consider that person or that unit being purchased. This is the maximum amount the market is willing to pay. If the monopolist knew that and charged exactly that price, there will be no consumer surplus because price minus willingness to pay would be 0. And basically, the monopolist will be extracting the whole welfare here. So the monopolist captures all consumer surplus as profit. That's perfect price discrimination. The advantage is that there's no deadweight lost. I mean, think about it. The monopolist is charging everybody the maximum they're willing to pay. Therefore, it is producing all the way here price larger than marginal cost equals average cost in this example. So we produce all the way to here while profit is positive for that unit. Every welfare is captured by the monopolist. But on the bright side, there's no deadweight loss. Now, it doesn't seem very fair since the consumer doesn't get any of the welfare. There's no waste, but all the welfare goes to the monopolist though. Now, in the real world, perfect price discrimination is not possible. No firm knows every buyer's willingness to pay. Buyers do not want to tell each sellers, why would they? So, in the real world, firms divide customers into groups based on some observable trait that is likely related to their willingness to pay, for instance, age. Here are some examples. Movie tickets. Discounts for senior students and people who can attend during weekday afternoons. They are all more likely to have lower willingness to pay than people who pay full price on Friday night. Therefore, I charge less for people that are willing to pay less and more for people who are willing to pay more. So that's a way of price discrimination. Airline prices. Discount for Saturday night stayovers help distinguish business travelers who usually have higher willingness to pay from more price sensitive leisure travelers. So that's another way to practice price discrimination. Discount coupons. People who have the time to clip and organize coupons are more likely to have lower income and lower willingness to pay than others. Need-based financial aid. Low-income families have lower willingness to pay for their children's college education. Schools price discriminate by offering need-based aid to low-income and families. So price discrimination does exist in real life, although it's not perfect. And again, that's a way that the monopoly extracts welfare from the consumer to the producer. Finally, quantity discounts. A buyer's willingness to pay often declines with additional units, so firms charge less per unit for large quantity than small ones. Example, a movie theater charges 4 for a small popcorn and 5 for a large popcorn, although it's twice as big. We all have noticed that when you go to the theater. So again, price discrimination exists, although it's not perfect price discrimination.